President Ijeong is set to deliver a policy address on a supplementary budget designed to respond to the conflict in the Middle East. He is expected to outline the direction and urgency of the plan, worth around $17.2 billion. While we wait for him to appear on the floor, we discussed the budget plan with Professor Shin here in the studio. Welcome, Professor Shin.
Always my pleasure.
Welcome back. Now, as the Iran war has dragged on past the 1-month mark, the burden on the South Korean economy is mounting, as we all know, right? Now, with a worst-case scenario that growth could fall to 0% if this war lasts for an entire year, do you think this is the critical window to push through a war-related extra budget?
Of course, of course. We have to remember that economic growth rate for 2025, which we almost all already forget about it, was less than 1%.
Right.
And less than 1% economic growth is among top 4 worst in last 5 decades.
Right.
So that means that year 2025 and beginning 2026, economic situation is really bad. On top of it, there happened the Iran war. So the government has been realizing that real economy has been really struggling for the almost last year under the new president. So understanding that this kind of Iran war is going to throw a serious challenge for the current administration. So I think it is right time and it's pretty desperate stimulus packages on the part of the government.
So given the economic situation at the moment, this budget, extra budget, is timely, you said. Now, supply disruptions to key feedstocks like naphtha have put industries on high alert. That is why the government is pledging 2.6 trillion won in support. Now, given the size of the support, do you think this level of support is sufficient?
Well, total, the president is expected to speak about the 26 trillion won's worth of supplementary budget. But if you look at the specific detail, about half of the amount is going to the local government. Because everybody knows that local government is having a financial difficulty. So about half of the amount is going to the local government. And if you look at the schedule in the supplementary budget, there's going to be about a little less than 5 trillion won's worth in reducing people's burden caused by higher energy costs. And also, another, a little less than 3 trillion won is going to be distributed to industrial kind of damages on the part of small and medium-sized economies. And another, I think, about 5 trillion won is going to be, distributed to stabilize people's livelihood. Right. So among 26 trillion won, it seems pretty big, but about half of the amount is going to the local government.
Right.
With about 16 trillion won, there are about 3 or 4 different ways to, support the government. So I would say that it may not be enough. We may probably need another supplementary budget in the second half, but that depends upon how bad, the Iranian war is going to end up.
Well, now that you mentioned that the about 5 trillion won, that's about $2.9 billion.
Right.
Now that will go to low-income households.
Right.
But that's targeting the bottom 70% of income earners, including myself. Now, do you think the broadening eligibility beyond the most vulnerable is the right move?
That depends upon what is the objective of the government in this supplementary budget. Of course, the president will be saying that it is directed to kind of support the pains on the part of the people because of the higher higher energy cost.
Right.
But the main, I think, objective behind this supplementary budget is, as I said at the beginning, the real economy is really bad. Real economy is just so bad that the government has to do something, even without the Iran war. So the real reason the government is planning to give lower 70% people at the maximum of 600,000 won is to boost real economy, to boost consumption. So in that respect, I think, just giving 70% of the people with the sum of, 600,000 won is understandable.
So it's to boost the domestic spending.
Yeah, domestic demand.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out because the government plans to distribute relief funds through local, currency vouchers, right? But inflation concerns are already rising due to high oil prices. Could this added liquidity further fuel price pressures?
No, at all. Because you have to remember that initially there was a Iran war, higher energy cost, and struck people's mind about economic future. So at the beginning, there was a shock in consumer demand.
Right.
That, I think, is going to lower inflation. And on top of it, government is putting money into the economy in order to kind of support domestic demand. Of course, it will raise a little bit of inflation, but you have to remember that at the beginning there was a deflationary shock, such as in the Iran war. So we cannot say, some scholars criticize that this is inflationary, right? If there was no Iran war, it could be inflationary. But at the beginning there was an Iran war, which could be pretty deflationary. In that sense, I think it is nonsense to say that, the huge amount of money is going to create inflation. I cannot understand that argument.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Then we can all understand and agree that cash support can boost short-term consumption, right? Boosting domestic demand, domestic spending. But the real question is, Professor Shen, can it translate into sustained recovery?
Well, we have to remember, annually, Korean people are consuming in consumption. The magnitude is about 2,000 trillion.
2,000 trillion.
Huge. So, about 20 trillion or 5 trillion,
That's trivial.
That's pretty trivial. So it is kind of psychological. First, the government is doing something for the needy people, but nobody in the government is believing that kind of, that amount of money is going to be enough to kind of, stimulate Korean economic growth. So I think we have to understand that, that there's a kind of a budgetary constraint. And that's why I think the government has to spend a little less than 5 trillion won, and in the hope that that is going to help, kind of the needy people. So I don't believe that's going to be enough to stimulate
Change the entire situation. There's going to be no dramatic change.
But a lot better than otherwise.
No, right. Well, the government says it'll fund the extra budget with excess tax revenue. So, marking the 7th case without actually issuing government bonds. Now, can we set aside our concerns that upward pressure on market interest rates will come?
I think that's pretty good, the aspect that we have to think about because, even without this supplementary budget, for the last, I think, 6 months, market interest rate has been going up very drastically. And there are many, complex reasons behind that. So the government cannot issue government bonds to finance any projects because that's going to create extra supply of budget, extra supply of the government bonds, and that's going to drive up market interest rates. So government is trying to avoid, as much as possible, not to issue government bonds. So in that respect, hopefully, I think in the second half of supplementary budget, I think government is trying to do something without issuing government bonds, because creating government bonds is going to induce a higher interest rate. So that is, but we have to remember that, you know, the size of government bonds at the moment is more than 1,000 trillion.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and annually we have to print another, you know, 100 trillion.
Right.
So it's going to drive market interest rate very, very fast and very, very high. So government understands that, and that's why the government officials are trying to do something without issuing government bonds.
Well, the whole point is the government is rushing to issue this budget, all because of rising oil prices, right, Professor Shin? Now, that's why it plans to launch a crude stockpile swap program for the first time, exchanging state reserves with, you know, private firms, the private imports. Do you think this will be enough to actually ease the domestic supply issues?
No, I think it's a short time, you know, short period measure,
Okay.
because many private enterprises are having difficulty having, you know, oil supplies from Middle East, and on the other hand, the government is possessing a huge stock of reserve crude oil. Somebody says it's about the 7 month worth of national reserve, but some other says it's about 60 days worth of reserve. So it is, on the part of the government necessary for the, to use national oil reserve to supply to the needy corporations, but that's a short-term measure. We cannot extend that to more than a month or more than 2 months.
That's short?
Because government has their own ways to use their national reserves. So it is a short-term measure, and we hope that Iran war it ends as soon as possible so that nobody has to worry about supply.
So it will be a temporary solution.
I believe so.
Now.
Sooner or later, I think the shock will end.
Well, that's one thing, but another thing is the exchange rate, Professor Shin. The Korean won is doing horrible, hitting its lowest level since during the financial crisis 17 years ago. Now that Korea has been included in the global bond index, do you think that could actually stabilize the currency?
Yeah, definitely. I checked, last year, 2025, international buyers have bought 58 trillion, 58 trillion ones of national bonds, which is huge.
It is.
So if you translate that to American dollar, I think that's more than, I think, 300, $30 billion, right? So that's a huge amount. So as soon as foreign investors are interested in buying Korean bonds, that I think is going to help, in great extent to stabilize Korean currency. The key question is how much that system, World Government Bond Index, inclusion of Korean government bonds is going to kind of, people to buy more Korean. But for the last, I think, 5 years, always, foreign investors are buying more than $20 billion worth, which is pretty substantial amount. So I'm hopeful that, exchange rate is going to stabilize sooner or later.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
Professor Shin. Well, the prolonged conflict is also fueling concerns of an economic slowdown. Professor Shin, I don't want to be dramatic here, but is South Korea heading to stagflation?
Well, that depends how you define the stagflation, right? When I was a student back in 1970s and 1980s, stagflation means inflation higher than 10%, economic growth lower than 5%. But now it is 1%, 2%, right? But if it goes down to 0%,
exactly.
could we say stagflation? Well, that is kind of questionable, but I think it is definitely true that economic growth last year about 1%, year before 2%. And if the economic growth rate goes down around 0%, we could say the economic situation is really miserable. And inflation, we used to have a 1%, 2%. If it goes up beyond 2 or 3%, it is inflationary. So if you define stagflation as 0% economic growth and 3% inflation, then I think you could say that is a stagflation.
I see. Professor Shin, as we are speaking, we now see President Ijeong has entered the hall to deliver his budget speech to the National Assembly. Professor Shin, this is President Ijeong's third budget speech to the National Assembly. Now, we are expecting that his key message will be fast approval of the budget plan. What political hurdles do you expect here at the National Assembly?
Well, I think there isn't much political barriers on the part of the government and the president because everybody knows in the world, in Korea, real economy is really bad. And the political, field has to do something for the people, right? And that is not just a recognition of the government, but also the opposition party members are believing that, government has to do something. So I think there's an agreement, in the Congress to have immediate kind of a passage of the supplementary. So politically, I don't think there is any difficulty on the part of the president to have this supplementary budget to pass from the Congress.
There are calls for cooperation. Floor Leader Song Won-seok proposing a bipartisan emergency roundtable that he hopes politics can be set aside in an emergency economic situation like this. Now, the government, like you said, is also calling for bipartisan cooperation. So you would say this is realistic in the current political climate?
Yeah. So there isn't much difficulty, except for the detail kind of differences of opinion. But generally, I think opposition party will be approving this kind of a project quickly.
What could those details include?
For example, you could criticize that why 70% of the people are getting the money.
70%.
Why not all the people?
Why not 80?
So a little amount of that kind of dispute could be possible, but generally speaking, I think it is a pretty reasonable, budget program.
I see. Then how would you assess this budget in terms of fiscal sustainability, Professor Shin?
Well, what everybody is talking about, Korean national debt is too much, but it's about 50%.
That's not much?
That's not that much.
Okay.
And of course, you could say that 50% is very important, kind of a barrier, but you have to remember there are, hundreds of thousands of people having economic difficulty. Government has to do something.
I see. Well, it looks like President Ijeong is about to deliver his budget speech to the National Assembly. We'll come back after his remarks.
It's very good to be here in a long period of time. It's a bit awkward. Anyhow, honorable fellow Koreans, Mr. Speaker, Woo Won-sik, and member of the National Assembly, I stand here before you today with a desperate sense of duty to protect the lives of our people and our economy in the face of grave crisis brought by the war in the Middle East. Today marks the 34th day since the outbreak of the war in the Middle East. This crisis, regarded as the worst energy security threat, is sending shockwaves through the global economy, and the uncertainty over when it may end is having a severe adverse effect on the economy. As the global economy enters a phase of slowdown, we're concerned that the fragile spark of economic growth that we have revived may once again fade away. Following the Kospi surpassing of the 5,000 mark and driven by the strong performance of our companies in global leading industries such as chips and shipbuilding, our economy had been presented with an opportunity to soar once again. However, the war in the Middle East has placed us in the face of an unexpected holy crisis. Disruption in oil supply have caused gasoline and diesel price to surge, and shortages of raw materials such as naphtha and urea are threatening the wide range of everyday economic activities, including the production of plastic products such as vinyl and fertilizers. Above all, given the possibility that the situation may not end in the short term, we must prepare. Extraordinary times call for truly extraordinary measures. Our government recognizes the current situation as one akin to a wartime emergency for the people's livelihoods and the economy, and is exerting every possible effort to overcome it. We have fully transitioned government organizations, including the presidential office, into an emergency economic response system, meticulously analyzing external risks and preparing for every possible scenario. For the first time in 29 years, we have decisively introduced a maximum price cap on petroleum, and together with the strengthened supply and demand management of key materials, we're implementing a wide range of policies to ease the burden on the public and minimize economic shocks. We're also making efforts to diversify alternative sources of supply, including securing the import of 24 million barrels of crude oil through cooperation with UAE. Looking back at past crises, the longer it took to respond proactively to unexpected shocks, the more exponentially the damage to our economy and our people. Taking these lessons, we are preparing for even the worst-case scenario, carefully examining the potential impact on overall economy and on daily lives of our citizens. Accordingly, today I stand before you to personally explain the rationale behind and the key components of the supplementary budget bill for fiscal year 2026, which the government has prepared with utmost urgency, and to seek the swift cooperation of the National Assembly. It is the rightful duty of the government to ensure that the taxes paid by the people are used where they are most needed and used in a timely manner. Guided by the principle that we must provide stronger protection for the socially vulnerable in the times of crisis, and determined not to miss the golden window for the economic recovery, we have prepared a supplementary budget totaling 26.2 trillion won. While making bold investments where they are most urgently needed in response to the war in the Middle East, we have carefully designed this budget to ensure that the burden is not passed on to our people or to the economy. In particular, let me make it clear that this is a supplementary budget that is a debt-free supplementary budget. It does not involve issuance of government bonds. And it is all thanks to all of you who are here today. And our economy was showing a little sign of growth. And now, let me explain. We will utilize 25.2 trillion won in additional tax revenues generated by strong performance of the stock market and semiconductor industry. Let me explain the detailed components. First, we will invest more than 10 trillion won in a three-pronged package to alleviate the burden of high oil prices and ease the pressure on our citizens. We have allocated 5 trillion won in earmarked contingency reserves to ensure the smooth operation of the currently implemented max price cap on petroleum and to respond to fluctuations in exchange rates. We will newly introduce a high oil price support grant to help relieve the burden on ordinary citizens of high oil prices. Approximately 36 million citizens, which is the bottom 70% of the income earners, they will receive differentiated supporting range of base amount of 100,000 won per person to maximum of 600,000 200,000 won. The grants will be provided in the form of local currency designed to support small business owners and self-employed merchants, which is also contributing to economic revitalization. We'll also strengthen energy welfare support for vulnerable sectors, including low-income households and farmers and fishermen. Among recipients of energy vouchers in low-income households, 200,000 households that are using kerosene or LPG will receive an additional 50,000 won, and we have significantly expanded fuel-linked subsidies for farmers and fishermen, as well as support for the purchase of fertilizers and animal feed. And also, to reduce transportation costs for ordinary citizens, we are going to increase the refund rate for the K-Pass program. Second, to serve as a strong pillar for support for people facing hardships in daily lives, we prepared livelihood stabilization package totaling 2.8 trillion won. Crises leave deeper scars on the people who are struggling. This is therefore essential that we provide stronger support to vulnerable groups who will feel the impact of the crisis more quickly and more severely. We will expand the number of free sharing centers, which provides essential food and daily necessities, from current 150 locations to 300 locations, so that no one is driven to extreme choices or falls into crime simply because they lack food. For small business owners experiencing difficulties, we will provide additional policy financing exceeding 300 billion won, and we will expand support under the Hope Return package by 8,000 additional cases to help the people, to the businesses to get back on their feet. We will significantly increase support for the settlement of unpaid wages and expand employment retention subsidies to ensure stable livelihoods for workers and to respond proactively to any sudden employment shocks. We'll also expand the regions eligible for rural basic income program, providing broader support to rural and fishing communities. We'll also pay closer attention to the issue of K-shaped polarization, in which disparities are widening across all sectors. In particular, this crisis is bound to have a greater impact on young people who are just beginning in the society. One solution is to create more jobs by expanding opportunities for entrepreneurship and employment. We'll invest 400 billion won in national funding in the Startup for All project, and we will devote greater efforts to build science-driven startup cities to spread the startup boom nationwide. For young people who are economically inactive, we will establish the K New Deal Academy, a job training program linked with major corporations to help them regain the courage. We will also lower the eligibility threshold for the National Employment Support Program, providing broader assistance to the young people without prior work experience. Also, we will expand discount programs for agricultural, livestock, and fisheries products, and also cultural activities such as performances, accommodations, and movies to support sectors expected to face difficulties because of this crisis. Third, we'll invest 2.6 trillion won to minimize damage to industrial sites and to safeguard supply chains that are directly linked to our economic security. Our economy's future depends on export companies and affected industries successfully weathering the current crisis. We'll provide strong support by significantly expanding logistics and financial assistance. We'll double the number of companies eligible for export voucher support to 14,000 firms, providing additional financing of 7.1 trillion won in export policy financing and 280 billion won in low-interest funds for the tourism industry. We must also lay the foundation for our economy to take the next leap forward after overcoming the crisis. In particular, we will turn this energy crisis into both a lesson and an opportunity by accelerating the transition toward renewable energy. will expand loans and subsidies for renewable energy to a record high 1.1 trillion won and significantly increase the number of sunlight income villages where local residents directly participate in the installation of solar power plants from approximately 150 to 700 villages. To improve the structure of our industries, we will expand the adoption of AI innovation across industrial and manufacturing sites and make bold investments. We'll also significantly increase the scale of policy financing for the content and cultural arts industries, reducing the hardship faced by this sector, and to ensure that the creative foundation, which is the root of K-culture, have a strong support. We will allocate 700 billion won to secure a stable supply base for petroleum and other critical strategic resources. By expanding support for the supply of naphtha, often referred to as the rice of the industry, and strengthening petroleum stockpiling, we will build a more resilient supply chain and establish a fair petroleum distribution. Finally, we will ensure that the local governments can also take the lead as key actors in overcoming this crisis. We'll reinforce local investment resources, including local allocation taxes and grants, by 9.5 trillion won, thereby supporting the efforts of local governments. Honorable Korean citizens, and also the members of the National Assembly, the crisis we now face is not a passing shower, but a massive storm that we cannot predict when it will end. That is why it is even a greater crisis. Even if the war ended tomorrow, it would inevitably take a considerable amount of time for the damaged energy infrastructure to be restored and for supply to return to the level of stability we once had. As we cannot foresee when this will end, we must overcome the present challenges with a long-term perspective and steady resolve while preparing for the future. To achieve this, above all, what we need is the united strength of all our citizens, the determination to share one another, their hardships, and to overcome the crisis together is urgently needed than ever before. We should make efforts to save even a single drop of fuel, refrain from wasting even one single plastic bag, and that is when we can overcome the crisis together safely and swiftly. The government and I, along with all public officials, should take the lead with an extraordinary sense of responsibility and resolve. We will respond with zero tolerance in strict accordance with the law to any acts that seek to take unfair advantage of the crisis facing our community. I earnestly appeal to all citizens to actively participate in energy-saving practices in daily life, such as using public transportation and conserving electricity. I ask you once again to demonstrate the resilience of the Korean people who have overcome countless national crises and turned adversity into new opportunities. Let us save together, share together, and overcome together. I would also like to ask your cooperation, Mr. Speaker Woo Won-sik and the honorable members of the National Assembly. Please join forces with one mind in the swift passage of this supplementary budget bill to overcome the crisis. This supplementary budget bill will serve as a breakwater that protects the lives of our citizens and from the waves of crisis, and as a foundation upon which the Republic of Korea can leap forward after the crisis. We must wisely resolve the crisis triggered by the war in the Middle East, turn it into an opportunity, and place our economy firmly upon the foundation that will never be shaken again. The success or failure of overcoming this crisis depends on speed. I ask for bipartisan cooperation to ensure the swift passage of this budget bill. In the face of a national crisis, let the government and the National Assembly move forward hand in hand the ruling and opposition parties guided solely by our devotion to the people and the nation. Thank you for your attention.
Now, that was President Lee Jae-myung's budget speech to the National Assembly with a strong emphasis on fast-tracking an extra budget to counter the Middle East shock. Now, let's get more insights from Professor Shin Se-dun here in the studio. Professor Shin, what is the single most important takeaway from the speech just now?
Well, it is difficult to pinpoint the single most important takeaway from President's address. But if I have to put just one point, I will say that is, he declared this is a national crisis. It is not a short-term crisis. It is ongoing crisis. That, I think, is the most kind of point that he's trying to make to the people. And second point, I think, is that he emphasized proactive response, proactive, quick response to the national crisis. Those 2 points, I think, are most important kind of point that he wants to make to the people.
I think he also tried to tame the public concerns that it is a debt-free supplementary budget, right?
Oh yeah. That is a third point that I have to mention. Budget without creating any national debt. But that, I think, it's about 26 trillion won, which is big. But compared to the size of national outstanding debt, it is about 2%. So we should be able to do this kind of projects without creating national debt in the future. As I said, there will be second, I think, a supplementary budget, because in 2025 there are two supplementary budgets. Right? So I'm expecting another supplementary budget in the second half of 2026. And the key question, that scholars are going to make is, could we do the second supplementary budget, second half, without increasing national debt? So that is an important point, but as long as, tax revenues are not supporting this kind of government policy, it's going to be pretty difficult. And we have to be ready, to accept a little higher, national debt, because it is crucial for the livelihood of the below average person in Korea.
Right, and as widely expected, he called for bipartisan cooperation in the National Assembly, and he also didn't forget to ask the South Korean people to adopt energy-saving practices, right?
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of, the kind of saving behavior in 1970s, 1980s. It's kind of,
you would know better than me.
Yeah, because I'm pretty familiar with that kind of move. But, we need more than that. We need more than, saving a few drops of oil. That's kind of a mindset, President wants for the people to have.
Right, to remind people.
But we hope, above all, we hope the Iran war ends before the April passes away.
I really hope so. Now, the government says this budget aims to both, protect the livelihoods of people and also support growth at the same time. Is this a realizable goal, Professor Shin?
Well, yeah, realizable, but the problem is the magnitude, with 26 trillion wons of, supplementary budget, you should not expect too much. It probably could boost a little, 0.1%, probably, but it is the dedication that the government is doing something for the people, and a real, the power of Korean economic growth is not in the hands of the president or in the government. It is in the hands of private sector. So, the private sector has to increase their investment for the future and increase, giving out more salaries to the people, and that, I think, is more powerful in, in increasing Korean economic growth. So it is just a part of the government, which is limited in the scope and in the magnitude, but it shows that the government is pretty dedicated to cope or to get over this kind of national crisis. In that respect, I think it is a pretty meaningful, address by the president. And he asked the political party, to unite it on that kind of a field.
Right. The budget is timely and appropriate given the economic situation at the moment. And also, now that President Ijeong has given this speech, the budget will be put to a vote on April 10th. And hopefully bipartisan cooperation is on the way for a smooth
majority.
process.
I think absolute majority in the Congress.
Alrighty, Professor Chen, thank you for coming in today. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you.
And we also thank you for staying with us throughout our special coverage of President Lee Jae-myung's budget speech. I'm Kim Da-mi. Goodbye.